For those that don't know me, my name is Bernhard Schussek, which is quite a horrible name, which is why usually I refer to myself as Web Mozart. You can follow me on Twitter if you don't. I'm Symfony core developer and also the representative at FIG, the Framework Interoperability Group, also a horrible name. I'm also working on Pulley, which is a new toolkit based on Composer to build packages for PHP. So if you want to know about that, you can talk to me. And I'm working as a trainer and coach and freelancer if you want any kind of services from that. Anyway, there's a question on heart. What's the hardest part in Symfony? Perfect answer. Thank you. So we had that answer, that question before. Symfony forms and security are probably the most difficult parts. Ryan did a great job at covering security this morning. Also, Sarah yesterday, if you followed that talk, explained the security component pretty well. So I want to cover the other part, which is forms. So a while ago, there was this tweet which reads, every time I have to debug Symfony2 forms, I literally die a little inside. Those are really one of the dark sides of Symfony. So I'm pretty sure you all know the feeling. It's not so nice. But there was an answer that I really liked, which is, have you seen Web Mozart's talk? It is the perfect pill for foam bows. So it's more like this. That's what I expected, right? Anybody see the pun on PHP? No? Okay. With the elephants, maybe? No. All right, so what about this form component? The form component was designed to make simple cases simple and complex cases possible, all right? So complex cases possible, that's definitely something that works, right? You can do pretty much anything. Don't ask me how, and it can be pretty brain-fucking. But it's possible, at least, all right? So, but the simple case is simple is something that's not always clear, and it's something that we're working on. So, especially we've been working on that in the last releases, again. Basically, we're constantly working on that. So I would like to talk a little bit about what's new in Symfony 2.7, 2.8, and 3.0. One thing that is quite apparent in Symfony 2.8, and especially if you upgrade to 3.0, is that we removed type names. What does it mean? Previously, when you created a form, you could pass a type instance or a type name if you configured that type in the service container. In Symfony 2.8, we changed that. Instead of those two ways, now you can pass the full qualified class name of the type, which is very easy with PHP 5.5. You just use the class constant, all right? So also, if you create a form like this, instead of passing all these type strings here, you pass type classes. I see your faces. So it's like, what the fuck? This is easier. So Michael wrote this tweet. I'm not sure some replacements are that useful. Text type class instead of text. Are you kidding? Like, really? That's easier. So I will tell you why it is easier, really. One thing that you can remove from all your form types, and it also means when you write a new form type, you don't have to do that anymore. You can just skip that getName method. Just throw it away. You don't need it, all right? Another thing you can remove is a lot of services. So in general, I recommend to register your form types in the service container because it's more efficient. Symfony can reuse your types. And previously, to do that, you had to register all your types in the service container because the service container needed to find out how to resolve such a type string to an instance. With Symfony 2.8, you can remove all of those services. Just select, delete. It's a really awesome feeling. There's an exception, and that's services that require other services in the constructor, so something like this. You still need to define those in the service container, obviously, but you can remove the alias now, so it's much simpler too. Looks like this. As for widgets, I don't know if you can actually see the red background on this one. Yes, okay. So as for blocks in your themes, previously this was, like the prefix of the block was the name of the type. This block prefix, as it is called, is now automatically calculated based on the type name. So if it's place order type, you would just do place underscore order now, all right? So you can just remove or change those block names if you want. If you want to keep your custom prefix, you can also implement the get block prefix method in your type, which can return any kind of block prefix. There's a nice thing here. You can remove, like previously, the type had to be unique, right? The type name. Block prefix can return anything. So if you implement some widget that should just reuse all the rendering logic of text, you can just return text here. That's very nice. Another thing that is new in Symfony 2.7 is the configure options method. You probably stumbled on that. So before, it was set default options with the options resolver interface. And now basically it's changed to configure options with a class instance. The difference is that nobody ever implemented the interface, I think. Did anybody implement that interface? No. I can see if there's anybody up there. No. So nobody did that, right? But on the other hand, we weren't able to add new stuff to the options resolver without breaking backwards compatibility. And Nicholas was talking about that today. We are very strict on that. So now with Symfony 3.0, we have this options resolver class instance, and we can improve it for you and add some new stuff that you can use immediately without doing any hacks. So some things that you can do, you could partially do them before, but it was more complicated. You can have required options, you can have validation for options, like validate them against specific types, validate them against specific values, and much more stuff. So I recommend you, if you're interested in that, go to the options resolver class and just check out all the methods that you have. Another thing that is new is the prototype data option. This one is in 2.8. It's for the collection type. Basically what it does, if you have a collection of forms in your form, and you want to edit that with JavaScript, you usually have like an add button, right? And this takes, like inserts an empty line in your form. And this empty line is called a prototype. If you want to set the default values of the empty line, then that was not possible in Symfony 2.7. With Symfony 2.8, you can actually pass this prototype data, and this will be the data of that new empty line, and you can customize that. Another feature that is new is the ability to return null from the query builder option. So if you have an entity type and you define a query builder like that, something that you should do, you can also return null, which is especially helpful if you have JavaScript populated fields, right? Like dynamic stuff, and maybe that field depends on another field or data of another field that hasn't been set yet or hasn't been loaded yet. And in that case, you can simply return null, and the field will remain empty. And when you submit the form and you have some data available, only then this query against the database will actually be executed. One very big thing, especially for people that are upgrading to 3.0, is that we flipped the values of the choices option. So before, the choice type had this choices option. You have this drop-down with different selects options. And these were the values as you use them in your application. So in your model, you would receive an empty string, 0 and 1. Here in this case, it's like, do I want to use express shipping? And we have 3 values, 3 state. No, yes, and decide later. And the problem with this design was that we can only select from values that can be stored in keys of PHP arrays. And that's only strings and integers, and quite limited. With Symfony 3, we swapped of our options are always strings, so we can easily store them in the keys. And it means that now you can select from any kind of data that you want, anything that you can imagine. So in this case, it's null, false, and true, which is much closer to what we expect in our domain model. But it could also be any kind of objects, for example. If you want to represent your selections by objects, then you can do that. Or you can even have nested arrays. Like if you get a result from the database, you do a select, and then you get rows, and you want to select from those actual rows without converting them to entities. You can do that. Of course, this is a backwards compatibility break. So in Symfony 3.0, choices are flipped by default. If you use Symfony 2.8, you need to set the additional option choices as values to true. So basically, it says that choices are now in the values of this array. And you should actually do that in Symfony 2.8. If you don't, you will get a deprecation error. And then in Symfony 3.0, if you upgrade further, you can remove this option again. And if you don't set that option, you will, of course, have all the default behavior in 2.8 that we had in 2.7. Again, together with that flip choices option came a lot of improvements. So one of them is the choice label option. This option controls the text that is displayed for your options in your dropdown. So in this case, if you're selecting from a number of objects, then you could set choice label to this property path title, and then the label of your options would be the result of get title on each of the choices. And you can also set this option to a closure, and the closure will be called for any option in that dropdown, which means it needs to be very efficient, needs to be very fast. Don't fire database queries in here, and be aware of lazy loads with doctrine. But then you can just calculate any kind of label that you want to display here in that closure. Similar to choice label, we added a new option called choice value. This one controls how the value of the option looks like. This is very interesting if you want to have some JavaScript that relies on values, useful values, not just incrementing integers. And you can set it again to a property path. So here we'll call getType on each of the methods, and you can set it to a closure as well. Similar to choice value, we added choice attributes. So that's something that was often asked for. To be able to specify attributes for the generated options here, or if you have checkboxes, attributes for the checkboxes. And you can do that now by setting choice attributes to the attributes that you want to include in each option. And again, as you probably guessed it, it's also possible to pass a function here, a closure, that just calculates whether to what the selection or what these attributes actually are based on the option. Some more stuff that is similar to that. I'm just showing that because I think it's very, very useful in many applications, even though it's a bit repetitive. We have a group by option now. So before it was already possible to group options by having a nested array here in the choices. And now it's also possible to use something like a property path. So in this case, category would be called on each payment method, and the result would be used as label here. Or you can use a property path if category is an option, object. Then it will call getCategory, getName, and use that. So that's very useful to remove a lot of code. And last, it's also possible to, of course, pass a closure. There's some more stuff that I didn't mention. You can read the changelog and the upgrade file if you're interested in that. But I think those are the most important and the nicest changes. So to the second part of my talk, I frequently hear that forms are so hard. Forms, I don't understand it. How should I do it? Lots of people have lots of doubts about how to do it right. This is this component. It's the most complex component I often hear in Symfony, apart from Symfony, apart from security. And in fact, it's not as hard as you think if you follow some basic guidelines. And today I want to give you basically my guidelines. So to start with, I would like to walk through the basic process that a form goes through when it is generated and passed to the view. It all starts in your controller, typically. The first step is you call createForm in your controller, which will call createForm in the form factory. And the form factory will create a builder, a form builder object. Don't worry about it too much for now, and pass it to buildForm method of your type, the type that you created. You can use the builder to add fields, to change settings of the forms, to do all that stuff, configuration. And once your buildForm method is complete, the form factory will turn the builder into a form. The form object is a bit different than the builder. It has actual state and it can't be changed anymore, but it is able to do a lot of complex stuff. And this form, returned from the builder, is passed back to the controller. That's the one you use. In the next step, you are calling handle request on that form object. The first thing that is happening, basically, is a handle request checks whether the form is submitted or not based on the request method, and also based on whether data that is expected to be submitted is actually in the request. And if that data is submitted, the data is written into all of the fields of the form, and all that stuff is happening, transformation, blah, 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 blah. I don't even want to go into the details. When we completed that, the object, in this case, an order, so that's the object that you wrote in your application, is updated. That object is passed to the validator, and the validator tells the form whether or not the object is valid and returns the errors. If it has any errors, the form just maps these errors back on the fields corresponding to the object. And then handle request terminates, goes back to the controller, and at last you call create view to convert the form into a form view. So at this point, a lot of information is gathered that we need to render a form, like HTML IDs, HTML names, CSS attributes, all that stuff that we need in order to render the form in Twig is added to the form view, which is then passed to Twig, to the template. So that's the general flow of a form from the perspective of the controller. And today I want to talk about a few best practices about different parts. So I want to talk about best practices from the perspective of the controller. I would also like to talk about best practices considering templating, best practices when it comes to validation, best practices when it comes to mapping our form to the data that we have, because there's a lot of questions for that. And then there's some stuff that I also want to talk about, like dynamic forms. How do we do that in our form? All right? As a disclaimer, please remember that's my best practices. So that's the way that I do it. In 80% of the cases, not in all. So for all of these best practices, there's exceptions, and that's for a reason. And also, if you do it differently for your reason, that's good, that's fine. I think it's just interesting for you to know what I was thinking about when I designed these things. And also remember, it's not just me working on the form component anymore. A lot of the features that went into 2.8 have been contributed by different people in the core team and the community. The first part I'm talking about today is the controller. So to make this a little bit more interesting, we'll do this in an interactive way. Okay, I've got a few questions with different choices. The first one is where to create a form. Basically, there's two options. First is we can create form builder in the controller, then add all the fields and turn it into a form right in the controller. And the other one is to create a custom form type, which is more work, and then we can do everything there, and it's reusable even if we don't reuse it. What do you think is the better way? So who votes for in the controller? It depends is good. Okay, these answers are like 80%. Everything depends, always in life, right? But we want to have a generic answer that works in most cases. All right, so controller. Form type? Pretty awesome. Cool. Another one. How to create a form type. There's two options. Doctrine generate forms. Automatic does all the magic for you. You get all the fields in your form type. Or you do it by hand. More cumbersome. You have to do everything yourself. Doctrine generate form? Who's for that? By hand? Pretty awesome. So in general, when you work with PHP, use something like PHP Storm. Use an IDE. It helps you so much. You can autocomplete so much code. You can check your code. You can add use statements. It does so much work that you don't need to do, and keeps your mind free for the more difficult stuff, like form events. Where do we submit forms to? We could submit a form to the same action or to a different action. Same action. Different action. Of course, the answer is it depends. But in general, same action is very easy and fine. So as you see, you were all right for basically all of the answers. It's not as hard as you think. And I want to talk a bit about more details and give you some tips what you can do or what you should do. One thing is, if you pass the form to a different action, which is valid in many cases, I recommend to pass the action in the controller. So when you create the form, you can pass the options of the form, and there's this option called action, which generates where you can pass the action that the form is submitted to. It's not the actual name of the route, but it's a full URL. So you can pass any kind of URL there. If you have a route, you need to turn that route into a URL first. The same for the method. If you want to submit your form with a specific method, you should do that in the controller. Of course, you could also do it in the template, but I don't recommend that for various reasons. So you should, when you create the form and you want to use a different method, pass the method option and just set it to put or delete or get or whatever. In general, use the right verb that corresponds to your HTTP request. Be aware of caching. So if you submit a form with get, make sure it doesn't have any side effects. Get is very good for filtering or something like that, where you just return, like you limit the result, but it doesn't have any side effect on the server, like actually storing data. One thing that I really like is when people use get requests for deleting data, because that means if a crawler goes to your website, they will access all those requests, and you will have to refresh your data very often. Also, don't pass dynamic data to the constructor of your form type. So that's something that is very common right now in Symfony 2.7, to just create like the type and then pass some data to the constructor. As I told you, in Symfony 3.0, you can't even pass type instance anymore. So, of course, that's not possible anymore. Instead, you should just create custom options. You can define those custom options in your configure options method of your form type, and then pass those custom options in the controller. That's a setting that varies form by form. So you can have different forms for the same type with different default shippings, in this case. There's other cases where you have configuration that does not vary form by form, but maybe you can just, I don't know, have a feature flag where 50% of your users should get one behavior, 50% of your users should get another behavior independent of the specific form. You can do that in global settings. And one way to do that is to just define a container parameter in services YAML or config YAML or app YAML or whatever you call it, like app, in this case, US shipping enabled, and then pass that parameter to the constructor of the form. And then you can access that value in your constructor, store it, use it in build form, do stuff. And that leaves you a lot of flexibility to control whether maybe you want to set the value in the configuration, maybe you want to have something else to do it more dynamically based on the request, stuff like that. All right, so much about controller part. Let's talk about templating. Templating is very often very interesting. So first of all, I recommend to use form, this form function for rapid prototyping. It's very quick. If you want to implement your PHP code and just try it, use that. It's very useful. But when it comes to actually, finishing your website, finishing the HTML, you should not really use that. Instead, I recommend to use form start and form end. It's not actually on the slide, but form start and form end give you a lot of additional features like rendering hidden fields, rendering CSRF tokens, rendering the request method if you don't use post or get, stuff like that. So use form start and form end, and use form row if you want to control the order of the fields. So there's some bundles out there that allow you to set in your form like where some field should be inserted, like the order of, like you want to insert a field before some other field. And all that stuff is completely useless actually in the controller and in the form model, because you can and you should do it in the view. Your designer wants to be able to influence the order, right? So if you want to customize your row a bit more, you can pass variables to that form row function, actually to all of the functions in the templates. You probably know that. And you should do that in the view as well. So many people do that in form types, like setting attributes in the form types, setting labels in the form types. That's something you shouldn't do, because then your designers don't have any possibility anymore to influence what attributes the different fields have, right? That's a possibility we want to give them. There's maybe one exception when it comes to labels. If you want to use message keys that you translate, you can obviously set those in the container, in the form type, since your designers are probably not that interested in message keys anyway. Also, if you haven't used it before, start using the form debugger. So this is still an old screenshot from 2.7. Javier did a great job to redesign the debug toolbar, so it looks much nicer now. Use the form debugger. It gives you a lot of information. For example, which of those variables are available. You see it there in the tab View Vars. So for every field, you see all these variables that you can set and their default values. You also see all the options for each field and their values and all that stuff. So it's very, very powerful. Use it. If you want to customize your HTML more than just using form row, write it by hand. Just write it by hand. I know it can be very repetitive. It can be especially for us developers, we want to automate stuff. This can be horrible, but for designers, this leaves much more flexibility in inserting fancy borders or backgrounds or icons or help texts, messages, stuff like that, and then tune it to be pixel perfect. So I really recommend to do that instead of creating themes. So in general, 80%, 90%, even maybe 95% of the cases don't use form themes. Don't. It's really complicated. It's like all the inheritance model, the way it works well, but you need to understand it properly, otherwise it's just confusing. And so don't use them unless you really need them. Like, for example, if you have an administration interface with 20 forms and all of them need to look exactly the same, maybe it's worth the hassle. But in most pages or most websites, applications, don't use themes. It's way too complicated. Just write HTML by hand. Let's talk about validation. In general, I don't use the assert clause because I think it clutters up the view. That's where people have different opinions, but I think annotations, especially with PHP Storm's annotation plugin, can easily be auto-completed even if you don't use that assert. So adding use statements or removing them is really not an issue anymore. Which brings me to the next topic. Use PHP Storm with the annotation plugin. If you use PHP Storm, it's very, very helpful. It auto-completes options, it auto-completes annotations and adds use statements and all that stuff. So it's really good. So for example, yes, I was talking about that. If you type an annotation and you do auto-completion, the annotation plugin will automatically complete that. When it comes to custom validation, one very good thing that you should consider is the expression constraint. The expression constraint is based on the expression language component, so you can pass any kind of expression there and validate that this expression is true. You have two variables that you can use in here. Value, which is the value of the current property or class, whatever you put the annotation on. And then this, which is the object that the annotation is in, independent of where you put the expression. So you can use that to have any kind of, more custom validation rules without having to do a lot of work. So this is very quick, very easy, and can be convenient in many cases. It's also a bit limited, especially when it comes to customizing the message. If you hit those limits, you can use the callback constraint. For the callback constraint, you just validate, you add a validation method to your model, annotate it with the callback constraint, and then have to do some more work, have to use the validator's execution context to add violations. And execution context sounds kind of scary. It's actually something very simple. It's one object that collects all the violations of your validator. And you can access a lot of information like the current class, property, and a lot more. Just check it out from this context. Most of the time, you will only want to call add violation here to add new errors. Also, it's a very good thing to use message keys for your violation messages because that externalizes the actual messages of your validation failures from your code, and you can have other people working on the actual messages in translation files. It's also very good to use message parameters. So as a user, if you get the message, the age is too low, it doesn't really help you if you don't know what the minimum age is, right? So it's a good idea to set like a parameter, minimum age or expected or something, pass the value there, and then include that parameter in the message so that the user actually knows what he's expected or she's expected to insert. If your validation becomes more complicated, if you want to have like multi-steps forms or an object that has different views, different forms, with different subsets of your validation rules, you should use validation groups. So you have this groups option for all your constraints where you can pass one or more names of validation groups. If you don't pass that, it's called default, but you can also pass any other group. Like here, we have a field total, which is not null, it's never null, but then it must be greater than 0 only for the validation group checkout. And this validation group can be set in the form in the validation groups option. You can pass multiple validation groups, and you can also use validation group sequences. This is a feature that I think not so many people know about. If you want to do step-by-step validation, like validate all your constraints, and then if all these constraints in one group are valid, we're going to validate some more constraints, maybe that use external services. So for example, VAT, like the European tax identity number, those numbers can be checked with a web service from the EU. And of course, you don't want to hit the web service every time that somebody forgets to insert a field or inserts text when they're expected to insert numbers or something like that. So you can actually group your validation constraints into two groups. All group, like the default constraints without a group, and then the expensive ones. For example, I call the group VAT check here, which is just for the VAT field. Passing a group sequence here will then have the consequence that the validator will first run this validation group. It could also be an array of groups, by the way. And then the next one. And only if all fields or all constraints in the first group succeed, it will go to the next group. You can also create domain-specific constraints for your business. For example, product name, if you want to reuse that constraint. And one simple way is to just extend an existing constraint. And here I'm setting the pattern in this option. And I say product names generally have to start with a word character, so a letter or a number, and then just any kind of other characters that follow. And here's a little trick. We set the validated by method, which is otherwise set by default, to product name validator. And I just reset it to regex validator class so that this constraint will be used or validated by the regex validator. And that's very nice because now you can actually annotate some information in your model with product name, and you basically encapsulated the information of what a product name is. You can also do that for composite constraints, so you can use multiple core constraints and compose them in domain-specific constraints. If you do that, you actually have to implement a validator, like product name validator, and here you can get the validator and validate some other constraint, like a regex, and maybe our product names must not be equal to some certain keyword because it's used internally. And then again, we can put the product name constraints anywhere in our model. A small tip, if you implement your validators, make sure you ignore null values at the beginning of your validation method so that you can combine it with not null or leave away not null, depending on where you need it. The last section I'm talking about is the model. As you know, forms are mapped to our domain model with a very simple mechanism. At first, when the form is displayed, all the getters for the form field names are called, and after submitting the form, the corresponding setters are called to update the object. In most cases, you want to decouple your form from the model. So if your domain model has been designed for some specific reason, leave it that way and decouple them from the model, from the form. You can do that by using property paths in the property path option. So if you set this to customer.name, instead of calling getCustomerName, the form component will call getCustomer, getName, and getCustomer setName. Actually, this should be VAT here, I think, for this field. So learn about property paths. They are used in, you have seen the choice field, in the property path option. There's different syntax possibilities. Customer.name means getCustomer, getName, and setName. Then you can use brackets to say items 0.amount, which is data get items, then the index 0 and set amount and get amount, and different possibilities. Do that to decouple your forms from your business model. If you have a business model with non-empty constructors, because in some cases this is very, very good to actually model the case of your business in your classes, then many people wonder about how can I do that in my form. There's an option for that. It's called empty data. This option contains the closure with a form, and you can use this option to return a new customer or a new object instance for that form and pass any kind of data from the submitted form to that object instance. So here we have a customer, we pass the name, we pass the address from the fields that the user submitted, and in this way we can create a new customer instance without violating or without changing our constructor to be optional. A very closely related topic is value objects. A value object is an object also with a non-empty constructor that is immutable and whose identity is defined by its value. So if you think about money, if you have $100 or euros and you have another object with 100 euros, they're considered identical, right? Even though it's not the same object, really, but they're still considered identical. So identity is defined by the values of the properties. And if you want to handle value objects in forms, we can take one step back, and maybe you've heard about data transformers and formats. All fields in Symfony have different data formats, the model format and the view format. For example, datetime type has datetime and string and converts datetimes to strings. So what we can do is we can create a money type with the model format money, our value object, and the view format integer, the amount. And we can extend, for example, the integer type to reuse some functionality, implement a data transformer interface, set the current object as data transformer. So I'm just inlining the data transformer interface in the same class. You don't always need to create extra classes for data transformers and for whatever you have, unless you want to reuse them in several places. And then you implement transform, and that's very easy. You have money, you return the amount for converting from model to view, and reverse transform for creating the integer back to a money. So reverse transform, new money, amount. So data transformers are a very, very simple way to deal with value objects. What about non-standard methods? Something like if you want to apply DDD and you don't want to call all your setters set something or getters get something. So in this example, I have the method relocate, and I pass an address. And again, I remind you of this process, setting data from the object to the form and back. And this process is called data mapping. And in order to support such custom method names, you can implement a custom data mapper. The way you do it is the same as with the data transformer. We have our customer type. Now we implement data mapper interface and set the data mapper to the current type instance. And we can implement two different methods, which are called map data to forms and map forms to data. And here you see you get all the fields in the form, and you can just use your custom getters of your customer to set the data of all the fields. When the form is submitted, you can implement map forms to data to take the data of the form fields and add it back to your customer with your custom setter methods. And that supports a method with one argument, a method with two arguments, or however many arguments you want. What about strict models? If you use PHP 7, you could do like a type hint here and set the strict mode to true. That, of course, doesn't work with the form component, since the form component first writes data into the object, and then runs validation on the changed object. If you want to do that, and if you want to decouple from doctrine, you should separate your model from the view model, the content of your forms. So you can just use simple DTOs, data transfer objects, to do that. In this case, we changed the data class of our form from order to place order. And now place order is a very, very simple DTO with even public properties because it doesn't do anything. It just contains, it's just a more powerful array, so to say. And if you want to reuse constraints from in both models, you can just use your domain-specific constraints, like order number, and then use them both in the DTO and your entity of doctrine. Still, I don't recommend to do that in all cases. If you have simple applications or throwaway applications that are just online for 3 weeks or a month, it's way too complicated. In that case, simply map your forms to doctrine entities. All right, last thing I'm talking about before I'm finishing for today is field dependencies, something that many people talk about or ask about. So if you have a country field and the province field, how do I do that? In fact, it's very, very easy. You can use events for that. And one key part that I get often asked about is, or people often wonder about, is that you add your event listeners not to the form, but to the fields. So if you have a country field, and when that field is filled out or submitted, you want to change another field, add the event listener to the country field. You can use the same event listener both for post-set data, that's when the default values are written into the field, and for post-submit, that's when the field is submitted. And that event listener can be very simple. You basically just get the form of the country field, so parent, the data of the country field, and then you add a new field depending on whatever data there was. This closure is reused both in both event listeners, actually. And that's all for today. So you see, form can be quite simple if done right. Of course, complex things are complex, and that can change. But if you follow some simple guidelines and upgrade to Symfony2 with the class constants and all this stuff, I think you will get a very nice experience. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Hello, hello.
I don't know if anybody's around with microphones. All right, I will just repeat the question.
Okay, so since you wrote a good VC premise for Symfony, can you promise us that you won't touch the configure option method name ever? Because we went from get default option to set default option to configure options, and it's hard to follow.
Okay, so the question was whether configure option will ever change again, since it was already changed twice. Probably not. No. Good question. Yeah. This one works now.
Well, what's the benefit of transferring method and action to form? I mean, form should not care about those two parameters.
The form actually does care about those two parameters, so the method is important for processing the form. When you call handle request, the form will actually care about the request method that you set in the form. So if you submit a form with, or if a request is submitted with put, and you configured your form with method post, the form will not be considered submitted.
Yeah.
About the action, it's generally the responsibility of the controller to control the routing between different pages. So you as a user go to the application, the controller decides what to do in the model to launch some services, and then decides where the user goes next. So setting the action is generally something that I think is responsibility of the controller.
Okay, but about the method, I mean, what's the real difference between put and post in terms of form parameters? I mean,
you can have pages that accept both in general.
Exactly. Exactly.
Also, you need to you need to duplicate that logic both in the controller anyway, since you need to check if it's the right method, and in the template. So in general, I think as this is also routing information, where does the user go next if they submit the form? I think this belongs into the controller.
Thanks.
Where's the next?
In your opinion, which place is better for constraints? Constraints option in form or annotation in the model?
That depends very much. If that information or the constraints are inherent to your domain model, like a car or a motorbike, for example, always has 2 wheels, right? That's information that belongs to the model. Then you should put it in the model. I don't care if you put it in annotations or YAML or whatever. If the constraints are specific to a form, like in this specific form, a user always needs to enter at least 5 characters, then you can put it in the constraints options. Both will be combined in the end.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Hey, do you have any suggestions on how to migrate custom choice lists?
Custom choice lists, yes, there is a new choice list interface, but that doesn't help you because you can't implement it. You can implement it, but you can't use it. Depends. You can, actually what you should do, there's a choice loader interface now. You have a choice loader option, and you can implement the custom choice loader and do that. The benefit is that this choice loader can be cached and reused. And I just submitted a PR, I think a week ago, that improves performance of such cases about like 50%. And that wasn't possible before. Other questions? Yes. So the question was, the question was, a one-to-many relationship is usually done with a collection type, and how can you filter the collection, I think?
Or sort.
Or sort the collection. You can, good question, you can actually, by default you can't, but you can do that if you maybe override the data mapper, so you can, before you pass the collection to the field, or before you pass it back, you can sort it, for example, in data mapper. That's something that you could do.
But in that case, I should fetch all the collection from doctrine and filter in PHP.
Well, you can prefetch the complete object from doctrine with a query before you pass it to the form. So you can join the collection and already order it in the right order. That's in general something that you should do anyway, since it reduces the number of queries.
Okay, thank you.
Just as I'm here, I'm not sure if I'm correct right now because I didn't use it for a long time now. For the standard data mapper in forms, setter is not called if the value is same.
Yes.
Right. Is there any reason for that, like technical or?
Yes, the reason is that you can have domain models where you don't want to provide a setter because the value can't be changed.
Of course.
For example, if you have an address and you only want to call the setters on the address but not on the address itself, or you want to call set address, or you don't want to make it possible to change the address object. What you can do though, there's an option called by_reference.
Yeah, but this is for collections or for objects, but for normal values?
It should work for normal fields as well. By reference is actually not just for collections.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
So if you set that to false, then the setter should always be called.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. Any other questions?
That's not a question, but an answer, actually. This is just about the order by. There is an ORM annotation for that, in fact. So you can order by using the annotation on your collection.
Yes, of course. Then you can order by, then the order would be used all the time. You're right. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Over there.
What's the reason behind the cascade validation removal?
You can set constraints with the valid constraint, and that will do the same without extra magic that is added to the form. So this is just using validation logic. If you, as you know, maybe if you have an object and you have another embedded object, and you want to validate both at the same time, then you set the property that contains the embedded object with the constraint valid. And that same constraint can be used in the constraints option of a form field. So you can just pass constraints new valid, and that will essentially do the same as setting constraint validation to true, or cascade validation to true. Back there.
Hi.
Okay, I think that's over. Sorry. You can talk to me afterwards.